People say time heals everything. They're wrong. Time doesn't heal betrayal. It only sharpens it. My name is Eleanor Grant, and 10 years ago, I lost everything to one woman. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa. My son stopped calling me mom. My house was taken from me. And my husband, Richard, died believing her lies. That's the wound that never stops bleeding. She poisoned him against me before she poisoned him in truth. At his funeral, I watched her stand beside me with dry eyes and a perfect performance. That day I made a promise. A promise forged in something cold and unforgiving. If it takes the rest of my life, I will take back everything she stole from me. This is not a story about forgiveness. This is a story about what happens when someone destroys your entire existence with a smile on their face. It's the story of how far a mother will go when everything has been taken from her. But it's also a story about cost. Because revenge doesn't come free. And by the end, you might find yourself wondering if victory was worth what you sacrificed to achieve it. My name is Eleanor Grant, and this is the story of how I destroyed the woman who destroyed me. This is the story of the fire I set that consumed us all.
Every story deserves to be heard. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Your voice keeps the past alive.
The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the lawn of the small Oregon chapel, painting everything in the warm glow of what should have been perfect happiness. White chairs stood in neat rows, their ribbons fluttering gently in the spring breeze. Flowers bloomed in carefully arranged clusters, their perfume mixing with the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant pine trees. It was the kind of day that belonged in magazines, the kind of wedding that mothers dreamed of for their sons. Eleanor Grant stood near the entrance of the chapel, watching guests arrive in their finest clothes. She wore a dress of soft lavender, carefully chosen for this special day. Her son Michael was getting married, and despite the nervous flutter in her chest, she wanted everything to be perfect for him. Michael had met Vanessa 8 months earlier at a business conference in Portland. She was young, ambitious, and striking in a way that commanded attention the moment she entered a room. She worked in finance, spoke 3 languages, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what she wanted. When Michael brought her home for the first time, Eleanor had tried to be welcoming, tried to see what her son saw in this polished woman from the city. But something had felt wrong from the very beginning. It was nothing Eleanor could name, nothing she could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." It was simply a coldness that lived behind Vanessa's perfect smile, a calculation in her eyes that made Eleanor's maternal instincts whisper warnings she couldn't quite articulate. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Michael stood at the altar in his dark suit, looking more handsome and grown-up than Eleanor could quite believe. When had her little boy become this man? Vanessa walked down the aisle in a dress of pure white silk, her dark hair swept up elegantly, her smile radiant for all the guests to see. They exchanged vows, exchanged rings, and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Everyone applauded. Eleanor applauded too, even as that strange unease continued to grow in her chest. The reception was held in the chapel's garden, under strings of lights that would glow like stars once evening fell. Tables were arranged around a small dance floor, laden with food and flowers and all the trappings of celebration. Eleanor moved through the crowd, greeting relatives and old family friends, accepting their congratulations and well wishes. Everyone seemed so happy, so certain that this was the beginning of something wonderful. As the afternoon wore into evening, Eleanor found herself standing near the gift table, watching Michael and Vanessa greet their guests. They made a striking couple, she had to admit. Michael's genuine warmth balanced against Vanessa's polished elegance. They looked like they belonged together, at least to anyone who didn't look too closely. Then Vanessa excused herself from a conversation and walked directly toward Eleanor. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the stone pathway, her smile fixed and bright. When she reached Eleanor, she leaned in close, as if to give her new mother-in-law an affectionate embrace. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a touching moment between family members. But the words Vanessa whispered into Eleanor's ear were anything but touching. "Don't worry, Mrs. Grant," she said, her voice so soft that only Eleanor could hear. "I'll take good care of your son. And your house." The words hit Eleanor like ice water. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she'd just heard. Vanessa pulled back from the embrace, her smile never wavering, her eyes meeting Eleanor's with something cold and triumphant. Then she turned and walked back to Michael, slipping her hand into his as if nothing had happened. Eleanor stood frozen by the gift table, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Had she heard correctly? Had Vanessa really just threatened to take her house? Seemed impossible, absurd even. They were at a wedding, surrounded by family and friends. No one would say something so brazen, so calculated at such a moment. But Eleanor knew what she'd heard. She knew the chill that had run down her spine was real, that the threat in Vanessa's eyes had been unmistakable. This wasn't paranoia or jealousy or a mother's reluctance to let go of her son. This was something else entirely. This was a declaration of war, delivered with a smile and wrapped in the guise of familial affection. As the reception continued around her, as people danced and laughed and celebrated, Eleanor felt the first real stirrings of fear. She watched Vanessa move through the crowd, charming everyone she met, her performance flawless and complete. She watched Michael look at his new wife with such love and trust, completely unaware of what had just transpired. That night, lying alone in her bed in the house she'd shared with her husband Richard for 30 years, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept replaying that moment, those whispered words, the look in Vanessa's eyes. She told herself she was overreacting, that it had been some kind of strange joke, that surely no one could be as calculating and cruel as that moment had suggested. But deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, Eleanor knew the truth. The wedding hadn't been a celebration, had been an invasion. And she had just met an enemy who was far more dangerous than she could have possibly imagined. That whispered threat at the reception hadn't been a warning, had been a promise. And Vanessa, Eleanor was beginning to realize, was someone who always kept her promises. The nightmare was just beginning, though Eleanor didn't fully understand that yet. She would soon enough. Within weeks, the first changes would start. Within months, her entire world would begin to crumble. And within a year, she would find herself exiled from her own home, watching helplessly as Vanessa took over everything she had ever loved. But on that night, in the darkness of her bedroom, all Eleanor could do was lie awake and wonder what she had done to deserve such a daughter-in-law, and what she could possibly do to protect herself and her family from what was coming. In the beginning, Vanessa's transformation of the Grant household was so subtle that Eleanor almost convinced herself she was imagining it. After the wedding, the young couple moved into the family home at Richard's insistence. The house was large enough for everyone, he'd reasoned, and it would be nice to have the family together. Eleanor had agreed, despite her reservations, because she wanted to give Vanessa a chance. Perhaps that whispered threat at the wedding had been a misunderstanding, a poorly executed joke. Perhaps things would be different once they all settled into a routine. For the first few weeks, Vanessa played her role to perfection. She called Eleanor Mom with apparent affection. She helped with dinner preparations and asked thoughtful questions about family traditions. She laughed at Richard's jokes and listened attentively to his stories. To Richard and Michael, she seemed like the ideal daughter-in-law, the perfect addition to their family. Only Eleanor noticed the way Vanessa's smile never quite reached her eyes, the way her helpfulness always seemed calculated rather than genuine. The changes started small. Eleanor's favorite tea disappeared from the kitchen cupboard, replaced with brands Vanessa preferred. When Eleanor mentioned it, Vanessa apologized profusely and promised to buy more, but somehow she never did. Family photos that had hung in the hallway for decades were taken down during a redecorating project, and never quite made it back up. Instead, new photos appeared. Professional shots of Michael and Vanessa, modern and sleek, with no room for the warm, cluttered family memories that had defined the house for so long. Eleanor's favorite armchair in the living room was moved to make space for a new entertainment center. Her gardening tools were reorganized in the shed, put in places where she could never find them. Small things, insignificant things, the kind of changes that seemed petty to complain about. But each one was a tiny erasure, A subtle message that Eleanor's place in this house was becoming negotiable. The meals changed too. Eleanor had always cooked Sunday dinners, a tradition she'd maintained for 30 years. But Vanessa began suggesting they try new recipes, new restaurants, new ways of doing things. She would compliment Eleanor's cooking while simultaneously explaining how a particular dish could be improved, how modern techniques made everything easier, how it was time to update old traditions. Within 2 months, Vanessa had essentially taken over the kitchen, and Eleanor found herself relegated to the role of helper in her own home. When guests visited, that was when Eleanor felt the exile most acutely. Vanessa would greet them at the door with her brilliant smile, showing them around the house as if she had always lived there, as if she were the true lady of the household. And then, with perfect timing and impeccable phrasing, she would introduce Eleanor in a way that somehow diminished her completely. "This is Michael's mother," Vanessa would say, her tone sweet and warm. "She's staying with us for now." Just those 6 words, "staying with us for now," and suddenly Eleanor was transformed from homeowner to temporary guest, from matriarch to burden, from mother to someone who needed to be accommodated out of charity rather than right. The phrase haunted Eleanor. She heard it over and over, saw the way guests' expressions changed when they heard it, watched as they mentally recategorized her from hostess to dependent elderly relative. Some would give her sympathetic looks, as if pitying her reduced circumstances. Others would simply turn their attention back to Vanessa, accepting her as the true mistress of the house. Eleanor tried to push back. She tried to assert her place, to remind everyone that this was her home, that she and Richard had built it together, that she had every right to be there. But every attempt made her look difficult, unreasonable, like an aging woman clinging to control she no longer deserved. Vanessa never confronted her directly. She never had to. Her campaign was one of whispers and implications, of small changes and subtle redefinitions. And it was devastatingly effective. Richard noticed none of this. When Eleanor tried to explain how Vanessa was systematically erasing her from her own life, he dismissed her concerns as adjustment difficulties. "You're just not used to sharing your space," he would say gently. "Give it time. Vanessa is trying her best to fit in. You need to be more flexible, more welcoming." Each conversation left Eleanor feeling more isolated, more uncertain of her own perceptions. Was she being unreasonable? Was she simply a jealous mother-in-law, unable to accept that her son had his own life now? Michael was even worse. He was so deeply in love with Vanessa, so grateful to have found someone who seemed to make him so happy, that he couldn't see anything wrong with her behavior. When Eleanor tried to talk to him about feeling pushed out of her own home, he would look uncomfortable and change the subject. When she pointed out specific instances of Vanessa's manipulations, he would explain them away, finding innocent interpretations for everything. His loyalty had shifted completely, and Eleanor found herself on the outside looking in. Then came the evening that changed everything. Eleanor was in her bedroom, the same bedroom she'd shared with Richard for decades, when Vanessa knocked on the door. She entered with a folder full of papers and that same perfect smile that Eleanor had learned to dread. "Mom," Vanessa said, settling gracefully into the chair by the window. "I've been thinking about your comfort and well-being. This house is quite large, and maintaining it is becoming such a burden. And honestly, I worry about you here. The stairs are steep, the rooms are drafty in winter. It's not really suitable for someone your age." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. "What are you saying? I found you the perfect apartment," Vanessa continued, opening the folder to reveal glossy photos of a small, modern unit. "It's near the park, on the ground floor, very manageable. Close to shops and medical facilities. Really, it's ideal. And the best part is, Michael has already signed the lease. Everything is arranged. You can move next week." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. Michael signed a lease. Without talking to me. "He wanted it to be a surprise," Vanessa said smoothly. "A gift, really. He's so thoughtful, always worrying about your comfort. Course, we'll help you move. We've already arranged for a truck." "This is my house," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. Richard and I built this house. I'm not going anywhere. Vanessa's smile never wavered, but something cold flashed in her eyes. Actually, Mom, if you check the deed, you'll find that the house was transferred into a family trust last year. Michael and I are the trustees. Richard set it up before his health declined. Surely you remember. You signed the papers yourself. Eleanor did remember signing papers, but Richard had told her it was just updating their estate planning, making sure everything was in order. She'd trusted him, trusted that he would never do anything that would leave her vulnerable. But now, looking at Vanessa's triumphant expression, she realized she'd been outmaneuvered. The house that she thought was her security, her home, her birthright, it was no longer fully hers to control. Behind Vanessa, Michael appeared in the doorway. Eleanor looked at her son, searching his face for any sign of the boy she'd raised, the man who had once called her his best friend. But he wouldn't meet her eyes. He stood there, silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands shoved into his pockets. That silence hurt more than any words could have. It was a betrayal so complete, so absolute, that Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. "Michael," she whispered, "please. This is our home. Your father and I." "Mom, the apartment is really nice," he said quietly, still not looking at her. "You'll be more comfortable there. Less to worry about. It's time." As if Eleanor had simply aged out of her own life. As if she were a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. She looked from her son to Vanessa and back again, and in that moment, she understood the complete scope of what had been done to her. Vanessa hadn't just married into the family. She had systematically isolated Eleanor, poisoned her relationship with her son, manipulated her husband, and engineered a situation where Eleanor had no power, no recourse, no choice but to accept her exile. The moving truck came exactly 1 week later, just as Vanessa had promised. Eleanor packed her personal belongings, clothes, books, a few photos that hadn't been lost in Vanessa's redecorating. Most of her furniture was deemed too large for the new apartment. Her dishes were unnecessary since the apartment came furnished. Her decorations were outdated and wouldn't match the modern aesthetic of her new home. As the movers carried boxes out of the house, Eleanor stood in what had been her living room and watched 30 years of her life being dismantled. Vanessa supervised the move with cheerful efficiency, making sure nothing was damaged, making sure Eleanor had everything she needed. Richard was out for the day, conveniently absent for this final humiliation. The keys to the house were collected. New locks had already been installed, Vanessa explained apologetically. For security purposes. Eleanor would of course be welcome to visit any time, but she should call first to make sure it was convenient. The message was clear. This was no longer her home. She was no longer welcome here without permission. She had been completely and thoroughly erased. That night, in her small, sterile apartment with its beige walls and industrial carpet, Eleanor sat in the darkness and felt the full weight of what had happened. She had been exiled from her own life, separated from her husband, estranged from her son, and robbed of her home. And she had been powerless to stop any of it. Vanessa had won completely, and she had done it with such calculated precision that no one else even saw it as an attack. To everyone else, it simply looked like a family making practical arrangements for an aging mother. But Eleanor knew the truth. This wasn't about practicality or comfort or concern for her well-being. This was about power and control and complete domination. Vanessa hadn't just wanted to marry Michael. She had wanted to take over every aspect of the Grant family, and Eleanor had been the only obstacle standing in her way. Now that obstacle had been removed, and Vanessa's victory was absolute. Or so it seemed. What Vanessa didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that exile does something to a person. It strips away the polite pretenses, the social contracts, the gentle ways we navigate the world. It leaves behind something harder, something sharper, something far more dangerous than a comfortable mother-in-law could ever be. Eleanor Grant had lost her home. Soon she would lose even more. But in losing everything, she would discover something that Vanessa would come to regret, A woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy of all. Richard Grant had always been a healthy man, the kind of person who viewed doctors' visits as unnecessary inconveniences and prided himself on never missing a day of work due to illness. So when he began complaining of fatigue and chest discomfort about 6 months after Eleanor's exile, it came as a surprise to everyone. The family doctor ran tests and found elevated blood pressure and some stress-related symptoms, but nothing immediately alarming. High blood pressure ran in Richard's family, the doctor explained. It was manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. Nothing to panic about. Richard was prescribed 2 medications, one for blood pressure, one for anxiety that the doctor suspected was contributing to his physical symptoms. The pharmacy bottles were labeled clearly with his name, the dosages, the instructions. Take 1 pill in the morning, 1 at night. Simple enough. Richard, being Richard, immediately forgot to take them half the time, leaving Vanessa to take over the management of his medication regimen. She was living in the house after all. She was right there. It only made sense that she would help. Eleanor, in her small apartment across town, heard about Richard's health issues secondhand. Michael would call occasionally with updates. His tone always slightly rushed, as if he were checking a box on a to-do list rather than actually connecting with his mother. "Dad's doing fine," he would say. "Just some blood pressure stuff. Nothing serious. Vanessa is keeping an eye on him." And Eleanor, who had been successfully isolated from her own husband, could do nothing but accept these sparse reports and worry in silence. She wasn't allowed to visit often. There was always some reason why it wasn't a good time. Richard was resting. Vanessa had plans that day. Michael was working. The excuses varied, but the message remained constant. Eleanor's presence was no longer welcome in what had been her own home. When she did manage to visit, always by appointment, always announced in advance, the meetings were brief and awkward. Richard seemed distant, tired, older than his years. He would ask polite questions about her apartment and nod at her answers without really listening. The vital connection they'd shared for decades had been severed, and Eleanor couldn't figure out how to repair it. About 3 weeks before Richard died, Eleanor managed to visit him while Vanessa was out running errands. It was a rare moment alone with her husband, and Eleanor intended to make the most of it. She found Richard in there, his bedroom, resting on top of the covers, looking pale and drawn. The sight of him shocked her. When had he gotten so thin? When had those dark circles appeared under his eyes? "Richard," she said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "How are you really feeling?" "Tired," he admitted. "Just so tired all the time. The doctor says it's the medication adjusting. Give it time." Eleanor's eyes drifted to the bedside table, where several prescription bottles stood in a neat row. She picked one up, checking the label against her memory of what the doctor had prescribed. The name was right. Richard's name was on the bottle. But something felt wrong. She couldn't quite identify what, but her instincts were screaming that something was off. "Are you taking these exactly as prescribed?" she asked. "Vanessa manages them," Richard said, his eyes already closing. "She's very good about it. Makes sure I take them on time." That was when Eleanor noticed that the pills inside the bottle didn't quite match the description on the label. The color seemed slightly different, the shape not exactly right. She wanted to investigate further, to check the other bottles, to compare them against the original prescriptions. But she heard the front door open downstairs, heard Vanessa's voice calling out that she was home. Eleanor quickly set the bottle back down, but the image stayed with her. Those pills that didn't quite look right, sitting beside her husband's bed like tiny time bombs waiting to explode. She mentioned her concerns to Michael later that week, calling him at work because he never seemed to answer her calls at home anymore. "I think something might be wrong with your father's medication," she said carefully. "The pills didn't look quite right. Maybe someone should check with the pharmacy, make sure there wasn't a mistake." Michael's response was immediate and dismissive. "Mom, Vanessa is incredibly careful about Dad's medication. She's been amazing, honestly. She tracks everything, talks to the doctors, makes sure he takes everything on time. If you're trying to suggest she's doing something wrong, That's really unfair. I'm not suggesting anything, Eleanor protested. I just think someone should verify. Mom, please. This is exactly what Vanessa warned me about. You're looking for problems where there aren't any because you're still upset about moving out. Dad is fine. His doctor is monitoring him. Everything is under control. You need to let this go. The conversation ended shortly after, leaving Eleanor feeling helpless and increasingly desperate. Vanessa warned me about. Those words echoed in Eleanor's mind for days. What had Vanessa told Michael? What narrative had she been building to preemptively discredit any concerns Eleanor might raise? The manipulation was masterful. Vanessa had positioned herself as the caring, attentive daughter-in-law while casting Eleanor as a difficult, jealous woman who couldn't accept her diminished role in the family. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday night in autumn, Richard Grant died in his sleep. A heart attack, the emergency responders said when Michael called them in a panic at 6 a.m. Sudden cardiac arrest. Tragically common in men his age, especially with pre-existing blood pressure issues. These things happen, they said. He probably didn't suffer much. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. The funeral arrangements happened quickly, orchestrated primarily by Vanessa with Michael's stunned assistance. Eleanor moved through the wake and service in a fog of grief and suspicion. She kept replaying that visit, those pills that didn't look quite right, the bottles that seemed to have been moved and rearranged on Richard's bedside table. But what could she say? Her husband was dead. Suggesting foul play without evidence would make her look unhinged, would further damage her already tenuous relationship with Michael. So she stayed silent, greeting mourners and accepting condolences and watching Vanessa play the role of grieving daughter-in-law. That was what struck Eleanor most at the funeral. Vanessa's performance. She wore elegant black, stood beside Michael with appropriate solemnity, accepted sympathy from friends and family with grace and dignity. But she never cried. Not once. Eleanor watched her carefully throughout the entire day, and Vanessa never shed a single tear. Her eyes remained dry, her makeup perfect, her composure complete. It was the performance of grief without the reality of it. And to Eleanor, who was genuinely devastated by the loss of her husband despite their recent estrangement, the contrast was glaring. The day after the funeral, Michael came to Eleanor's apartment with a manila envelope. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by grief, barely holding himself together. Eleanor made him tea, which he didn't drink, and waited for him to speak. "There are some insurance papers you need to sign," he finally said, sliding the envelope across her small kitchen table. "Dad's life insurance. The lawyer needs them processed." Eleanor opened the envelope with trembling hands, expecting to see the familiar policy that she and Richard had set up decades ago. They had always been each other's primary beneficiaries, with Michael as the secondary. It was standard, simple, exactly what you'd expect from a married couple planning their estate. But the paperwork in front of her told a different story. The primary beneficiary had been changed. Eleanor's name had been replaced with a new one. Vanessa Grant. The change had been made exactly 2 weeks before Richard's death. 2 weeks. 14 days. Just enough time to ensure the change was processed and official before Richard's sudden, convenient heart attack. Eleanor's hands began to shake so badly that the papers rattled. She looked up at her son, searching his face for any sign that he understood the significance of what she was seeing, that he recognized the impossibility of this timing being coincidental. But Michael just looked confused by her reaction. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Michael," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father changed his insurance beneficiary 2 weeks before he died." 2 weeks. Don't you find that strange? Michael frowned. Dad talked about it with Vanessa a few months ago. He wanted to make sure she and I would be taken care of if anything happened to him. He was worried about his health. It makes sense that he'd update things. "But I'm his wife," Eleanor said. "We were married for 35 years. And he changed the beneficiary to your wife. Not even to you." "Vanessa is family," Michael said defensively. "And she's been managing our finances. Dad trusted her. He probably figured she'd handle distributing everything appropriately. "Mom, I know you're grieving, but you're making something sinister out of a perfectly reasonable decision." Eleanor looked at her son and realized that she had completely lost him. Vanessa's grip on Michael was so complete, so total, that he couldn't see the obvious manipulation happening right in front of him. Or perhaps he didn't want to see it. Perhaps accepting that his wife might have orchestrated his father's death was too horrific a reality to contemplate. That night, alone in her apartment with the insurance papers spread across her table, Eleanor stopped being a grieving widow. The tears dried up, replaced by something colder and harder. She thought about Richard, about how he'd died believing she was difficult and unreasonable. She thought about those pill bottles with their slightly wrong contents. She thought about Vanessa's dry eyes at the funeral, and the insurance change that was completed exactly 2 weeks before a supposedly unexpected death. Eleanor Grant had lost her home, her son, and now her husband. She had been systematically stripped of everything that mattered, everything that defined her existence. Most people facing such complete devastation would have broken, would have accepted defeat, succumbed to grief, faded quietly away into irrelevance and despair. But something had changed in Eleanor that night. The mother, the wife, the woman who had always tried to be reasonable and understanding and forgiving, that woman died alongside her husband. What remained was something sharper, something dangerous, something that understood revenge not as an emotional reaction but as a careful, calculated art form. Eleanor pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote a single sentence on the first page. "Revenge begins today." She didn't cry anymore. Tears were a luxury for people who still had something to lose. Eleanor had nothing left except this cold, burning purpose. And she would spend every remaining day of her life making Vanessa understand exactly what she had done. That night marked the transformation. Eleanor Grant stopped being a victim. She became a hunter instead. And Vanessa, for all her intelligence and calculation, had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated what a mother would do when her entire family was destroyed. The game was no longer about survival or defending her place in the family. The game was now about justice, about exposure, about making absolutely certain that Vanessa paid for every single crime she had committed. Eleanor didn't yet know exactly how she would do it. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would succeed. Because the thing about exile, the thing Vanessa had failed to understand, is that it gives you clarity. It strips away all the social niceties, all the reasons to hold back, all the considerations that keep civilized people from pursuing vengeance. Eleanor had nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose. And that made her the most dangerous opponent Vanessa could have possibly created. The night of Richard's death was the night Eleanor stopped defending. It was the night she started attacking. And though Vanessa didn't know it yet, though she was probably celebrating her complete victory, her perfect crime, her absolute control over the Grant family, her reign was already beginning to crumble. Because Eleanor had decided that if she was going to lose everything, she would make absolutely certain that Vanessa lost everything too. And unlike Vanessa's crimes, Eleanor's revenge would be perfectly legal, completely documented, and utterly inevitable. The hunt had begun. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Eleanor Grant spent the first week after the funeral in a haze, moving through her small apartment like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be. A grieving widow, broken and defeated, no longer a threat to anyone. But inside, behind her red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, a different Eleanor was emerging. This one was methodical. This one understood that emotion was the enemy of effective action. This one knew that if she was going to take down someone as calculating as Vanessa, she would need to be twice as careful, twice as patient, and infinitely more thorough. The notebook Eleanor had started on the night of Richard's death became her constant companion. In it, she began documenting everything she could remember. Every strange interaction with Vanessa. Every manipulation, every lie, every subtle cruelty. She wrote down dates and times, recording conversations as accurately as her memory allowed. She noted the names of people who had been present, who might be able to corroborate details. It wasn't evidence, not yet, but it was a foundation. Then Eleanor began the real work. She started with the prescription bottles. On her last visit to see Richard, she had managed to pocket one of the pill bottles from his bedside table while Vanessa was distracted. At the time, she'd acted on instinct, not really knowing why she was taking it. Now, that bottle sat on her kitchen table like a tiny promise of justice. Eleanor took the bottle to 3 different pharmacies, showing it to pharmacists she didn't know, asking innocent questions. Was this the right medication for blood pressure? Did the pills look correct? In each case, the pharmacists compared the pills in the bottle against their records of what the prescription should have contained. And in each case, their expressions shifted from helpful to concerned. The pills weren't quite right. The dosage was wrong. One pharmacist suggested the medication might have been tampered with or switched. Eleanor documented everything. She took photos of the bottle from every angle. She got written statements from 2 of the pharmacists, carefully worded observations about prescription irregularities. She made copies of everything and stored them in multiple locations. This was evidence. Not conclusive, not enough to prove murder on its own, but evidence nonetheless. The first real piece in a puzzle Eleanor was determined to complete. Next, she turned her attention to the insurance change. Something about that timing bothered her deeply. 2 weeks wasn't random. It was deliberate. It suggested planning, forethought, premeditation. Eleanor spent hours at the public library, using their computers to research insurance fraud, suspicious death investigations, patterns of financial manipulation. She learned about red flags that investigators looked for, about how seemingly perfect crimes could unravel under scrutiny. Then Eleanor reached out to an old friend, Margaret Chen, who worked in the county clerk's office. Margaret and Eleanor had been in a book club together for 15 years, and their friendship had survived even Eleanor's recent exile. Over coffee at a quiet diner, Eleanor asked Margaret if she could help with some genealogical research. She was, Eleanor explained, trying to piece together her family tree and needed to look up some public records. It wasn't entirely a lie. Eleanor was researching her family tree. Specifically, the newest branch that had been grafted onto it. Using Margaret's access and guidance, Eleanor began digging into Vanessa's past, and what she found made her blood run cold. Vanessa's maiden name was Vanessa Hartley, and she had indeed worked in finance in Portland, exactly as she'd told Michael. But before Portland there had been other cities. San Francisco, Seattle, Denver. Each time, Vanessa had worked for financial firms, and each time, she had left under circumstances that, while not overtly suspicious, were murky enough to raise questions. Then Eleanor found the bankruptcy filing. It was under a slightly different name, Vanessa M. Hartley instead of just Vanessa Hartley, and it had been filed 6 years ago in San Francisco. The filing showed debts exceeding $200,000, mostly credit cards and personal loans. For someone who presented herself as a successful finance professional, that level of personal financial disaster was a massive red flag. But it got worse. Digging deeper, using public records and old news archives the library gave her access to, Eleanor discovered something that made her hands shake. Before she was Vanessa Hartley, she had been Vanessa Morrison. She had changed her name legally 5 years ago, shortly after leaving San Francisco. Why would someone change their name unless they were running from something? The answer came in the form of an obituary from 5 years earlier. James Morrison, age 42, died unexpectedly from a heart attack at his home in San Francisco. Survived by his fiancée, Vanessa Morrison. The funeral announcement. The tragic accident. The grieving partner. It all sounded so familiar, so eerily similar to what had happened to Richard. Eleanor spent 3 days verifying everything she could about James Morrison's death. She couldn't access official death certificates or police reports, but she could read newspaper archives, public social media posts, and court records. What she found was a pattern. James Morrison had been a successful real estate investor. He had, according to public records, recently updated his life insurance policy. 3 weeks later he was dead. And Vanessa Morrison had collected a substantial payout before quietly leaving California and reinventing herself as Vanessa Hartley. 2 men, 2 heart attacks, 2 insurance payouts, 2 names changes. The pattern was unmistakable. Vanessa wasn't just a manipulative daughter-in-law. She was a serial predator, moving from victim to victim, taking what she wanted and disappearing into a new identity when things got too complicated. Eleanor documented everything. She created a timeline, printing out public records and news articles, organizing them into a clear narrative. She photocopied everything multiple times, storing copies in her apartment, in a safe deposit box at the bank, and with her lawyer. This wasn't just about proving Richard's murder anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of predatory behavior that had destroyed multiple lives. Through her research, Eleanor also discovered that Vanessa had embezzled money from one of her previous employers in Denver. The case had been settled quietly out of court, the records sealed, but Eleanor found mentions of it in business litigation databases that Margaret helped her access. Vanessa had stolen nearly $50,000 from a charity fund she was managing, funneling it through fake vendor accounts. She had been fired but never prosecuted, the company preferring to avoid the publicity of a scandal. Every piece of information Eleanor uncovered made the picture clearer. Vanessa wasn't just opportunistic. She was systematic. She identified targets, successful men, often slightly older, often with assets she could acquire. She charmed her way into their lives, isolated them from their support systems, gained control over their finances and medications, and then waited for the right moment to strike. After each successful operation, she would disappear, change her identity slightly, and move on to the next victim. Michael had been her latest target, and the Grant family her latest conquest. But Vanessa had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated Eleanor. She had assumed that once Eleanor was exiled and Richard was dead, there would be no one left who could challenge her, no one who would dare to investigate or question or fight back. But Eleanor was fighting back. Quietly, carefully, methodically. She compiled her evidence into a comprehensive dossier. She created backup copies of everything. She wrote detailed summaries of her findings, complete with citations and references to public records that anyone could verify. She organized it all into a clear, damning narrative that would be impossible to dismiss as the ramblings of a bitter mother-in-law. Then Eleanor did something that would prove to be her smartest move. She took everything to a lawyer. Not her family's usual attorney, who might have connections to Vanessa or loyalties that could be compromised. Eleanor found a new lawyer, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation cases. Patricia had a reputation for being tough, thorough, and absolutely relentless when she believed her clients had been wronged. Eleanor spent 3 hours in Patricia's office, walking her through every piece of evidence, every suspicious circumstance, every element of the pattern she had uncovered. She presented it calmly, without histrionics or emotional appeals, letting the facts speak for themselves. When she finished, Patricia sat back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. "Mrs. Grant," Patricia said carefully, "what you've uncovered here is substantial. If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at insurance fraud, possible homicide, and a pattern of criminal behavior spanning multiple states. But I need to be clear with you. Proving any of this beyond a reasonable doubt will be extremely difficult. The evidence is largely circumstantial. The deaths were ruled natural causes. Without an exhumation and new autopsy, without testimony from someone close to Vanessa, without her making a mistake that gives us direct evidence." "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "That's why I'm not going to the police. Not yet. Not until I have everything I need." "What are you planning?" Patricia asked, a note of concern in her voice. "I'm planning to protect myself," Eleanor said. "Vanessa has been trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. She's been telling Michael that I'm losing my memory, becoming unstable, that I need to be in a care facility where I can be supervised. If she succeeds, everything I've gathered disappears. My testimony becomes unreliable. Any accusations I make get dismissed as delusions. Eleanor opened her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope, placing it carefully on Patricia's desk. "This contains copies of everything I've found. Every piece of evidence, every document, every photograph. If anything happens to me, if I die unexpectedly, if I get institutionalized, if I disappear, I need you to open this. Take it to the authorities. Make sure the investigation happens. Make sure Vanessa doesn't get away with it." Patricia picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. "You're essentially creating a dead man's switch." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "Vanessa's power comes from operating in the shadows, from making sure no one looks too closely. But if she knows that her secrets will be exposed the moment I'm gone, if she understands that harming me will trigger exactly the investigation she's been avoiding, then I become too dangerous to touch." "And if nothing happens to you?" Patricia asked. "What then?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "Then I keep digging. Keep watching. I wait for her to make a mistake. 'Cause people like Vanessa always make mistakes eventually. They get overconfident. They get sloppy. And when that moment comes, I'll be ready." Patricia agreed to hold the envelope and to act as Eleanor's legal advocate if Vanessa continued her campaign to have Eleanor declared incompetent. They set up a regular check-in system. Eleanor would call Patricia's office every Friday at noon. If Eleanor missed more than 2 consecutive calls without explanation, Patricia would open the envelope and take appropriate action. It was, Eleanor realized, the first time since Richard's death that she felt something other than helpless. She had created protection for herself. She had laid groundwork for justice. She had transformed from victim to investigator, from target to threat. But the most important thing Eleanor had done was to document her findings in a journal entry that she placed at the front of her dossier. In clear, calm language, she wrote, "If you are reading this, it means something has happened to me. Everything documented here represents months of careful research into Vanessa Grant, formerly known as Vanessa Hartley and Vanessa Morrison. I believe my husband Richard Grant was murdered. I believe James Morrison was murdered before him. I believe Vanessa is a serial predator who targets men for their assets and eliminates them when convenient. I am not delusional. I am not suffering from dementia. I am a woman who has spent months carefully documenting a pattern of criminal behavior. Please investigate. Please don't let her do this to anyone else." That night, back in her small apartment, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Not hope that everything would be fine, not hope that her family would be restored or her losses reversed, but hope that justice might actually be possible. Hope that Vanessa's reign of manipulation and murder might actually come to an end. Eleanor opened her journal and wrote a new entry. "The trap is set. Now I wait." And wait she did. She continued her regular routine, continued to act like a grieving, diminished widow. She didn't confront Vanessa. She didn't make accusations or demands. She simply watched, documented, and prepared. Because Eleanor understood something that Vanessa didn't. Revenge isn't about dramatic confrontations or emotional outbursts. Real revenge is about patience. It's about building an unassailable case, piece by piece, until the walls close in and there's no escape. Vanessa continued her life, completely unaware that she was being hunted. She played the devoted wife, the successful businesswoman, the perfect daughter-in-law to Michael's extended family. She managed the Grant household with efficiency and charm. She even made occasional magnanimous calls to Eleanor, checking on her welfare with saccharine concern that made Eleanor's skin crawl. But Eleanor knew something Vanessa didn't. She knew about James Morrison. She knew about the embezzlement. She knew about the prescription tampering. She knew about the insurance fraud. And most importantly, she knew that Vanessa would eventually make a mistake. Because people who have gotten away with crimes multiple times inevitably become careless. They start to believe they're untouchable, invincible, too smart to ever be caught. Eleanor would be there when that moment came. Patient, prepared, and absolutely ready to strike. The silent plan was in motion, and nothing would stop it now. The pressure on Eleanor intensified about 3 months after Richard's death. Michael had been visiting less and less frequently, his calls becoming shorter and more perfunctory. Eleanor could feel him slipping further away, could sense Vanessa's influence growing stronger with each passing week. Then came the phone call that Eleanor had been expecting but dreading nonetheless. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," Michael said one evening, his voice strained and uncomfortable. "Vanessa and I have been discussing it, and we think it might be time to consider some additional support for you." Eleanor kept her voice steady, calm. "What kind of support, Michael?" "Well, you've been struggling since Dad died. We've noticed you seem confused sometimes, forgetful. You called me 3 times last week asking about the same doctor's appointment. Vanessa is worried you might not be safe living alone." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. She had called Michael 3 times last week, that was true. But it had been about 3 different appointments, not the same one repeated. The confusion was deliberate misrepresentation, a careful distortion of reality designed to make her seem incompetent. It was brilliant, really, in its cruelty. "I'm doing fine, Michael," Eleanor said carefully. "I'm grieving, yes, but I'm not confused. I'm managing my own life perfectly well." "That's not what we're seeing, Mom. And honestly, living in that small apartment by yourself with no family nearby. Vanessa found a really nice assisted living facility. It's not a nursing home," he added quickly, as if that made it better. "It's more like a retirement community. You'd have your own small apartment, but there would be staff available if you needed help. Meals provided, activities, other people your age. It could be really good for you." There it was. The final play in Vanessa's strategy. If Eleanor was institutionalized, declared incompetent and placed in a facility, then any accusations she made would be dismissed as the delusions of a mentally declining woman. Any evidence she had gathered would be discredited. Her testimony would be worthless. It was the perfect way to neutralize the last potential threat to Vanessa's complete control. Eleanor took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was where everything could fall apart. If she fought too hard, she would look paranoid and unstable, proving their point. If she agreed, she would lose her freedom and any ability to continue her investigation. She needed to navigate this carefully, buying time without appearing to resist too obviously. "Michael, I appreciate your concern," Eleanor said, keeping her tone reasonable. "But I'm not ready for assisted living. I'm only 68 years old. I'm healthy, I'm independent, I'm managing fine. If you're genuinely worried about me, why don't you visit more often? Actually spend time with me instead of making decisions based on what Vanessa tells you." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Mom, please don't make this about Vanessa. She's been nothing but concerned for your welfare. She's the one who researched facilities, who found options that would work for you. You're being unfair to her." "Am I?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Michael, do you remember when I used to call you every Sunday? When we would talk for an hour about your week, about your life? When did we stop doing that? When did I become someone you check on out of obligation rather than love?" "Mom, I miss my son," Eleanor said, and for the first time, she let real emotion creep into her voice. "I miss my family. I miss my life. And instead of helping me rebuild after everything I've lost, you want to put me in a facility. Can you understand how that feels?" Another long silence. Eleanor could hear Vanessa's voice in the background, though she couldn't make out the words. Michael cleared his throat. "We'll talk about this more later. But Mom, please think about it seriously. We're trying to help you." The call ended, leaving Eleanor sitting in her small apartment with her heart pounding. She had bought herself some time, but not much. Vanessa was moving forward with her plan, and Michael was completely under her influence. Eleanor needed to act soon, or she would find herself locked away where she couldn't fight back. That evening, Eleanor made her scheduled Friday call to Patricia Rodriguez. But instead of just the usual check-in, Eleanor explained what was happening. The assisted living plan, the claims of her declining mental state, the pressure from Michael to accept placement. Patricia listened carefully, then asked Eleanor to come to her office first thing Monday morning. "We need to get ahead of this," Patricia said. If Vanessa tries to have you declared incompetent, we need documentation that you're of sound mind. I'm going to arrange for you to be evaluated by an independent psychologist. Someone who can testify that you're competent to make your own decisions. We'll get medical records showing you have no cognitive decline. We'll build a paper trail that proves you're being targeted, not protected. Eleanor agreed immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, she underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation. She met with doctors who assessed her memory, her reasoning, her ability to manage her own affairs. She was calm, articulate, and clearly competent. The psychologist's report was unambiguous. Eleanor Grant was a grieving widow dealing with significant family stress, but she showed no signs of dementia, confusion, or inability to manage her own life. Armed with this documentation, Patricia drafted a formal letter to Michael and Vanessa. The letter, sent via certified mail, made several things clear. Eleanor Grant was legally competent and had documentation proving it. Any attempt to have her institutionalized against her will would be contested in court. Eleanor had legal representation and was prepared to fight for her right to independence. And finally, in carefully neutral language, the letter noted that Patricia's office was in possession of materials related to Eleanor's concerns about financial irregularities in the Grant family estate. That last line was deliberate. It wasn't a direct threat, but it was a clear signal. Eleanor wasn't powerless. She had evidence, she had legal representation, and she was prepared to make things very difficult if they pushed her. The response came not from Michael, but from Vanessa. She called Patricia's office directly, her voice smooth and concerned. She explained that there had been a misunderstanding, that no one was trying to force Eleanor into anything, that they were simply exploring options for Eleanor's benefit. She was sure they could all work together to find a solution that everyone was comfortable with. The conversation was professional, pleasant, and completely devoid of any admission of wrongdoing. But Eleanor knew what that call really meant. Vanessa had received the message. She understood that Eleanor had prepared defenses, that attacking her directly would no longer be easy or risk-free. The pressure to institutionalize Eleanor quietly disappeared. Michael stopped bringing it up. The crisis had been averted. But Eleanor understood something crucial about that victory. It was temporary. Vanessa had backed off not because she had given up, but because she was recalculating. She was looking for a different approach, a new angle of attack. People like Vanessa didn't surrender. They adapted. So Eleanor adapted too. She continued her investigation, but now she focused on something specific. She needed direct evidence. All the circumstantial proof in the world wouldn't matter if she couldn't demonstrate an actual crime. She needed something concrete, something undeniable. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Eleanor received a phone call from a woman named Jennifer Morrison, who had seen Eleanor's name in some public record searches related to Vanessa. Jennifer was James Morrison's sister, and she had never believed that her brother's death was natural. She had her own suspicions about Vanessa, her own doubts about the convenient timing of everything. But she had been dismissed by police, by family members, by everyone who thought she was just a grieving sister unable to accept a tragic loss. The two women met at a coffee shop halfway between their cities. They compared notes, shared evidence, validated each other's concerns. Jennifer had kept records too. Strange financial transactions before James's death, changes to his will, suspicious circumstances she had documented but could never get anyone to take seriously. Together, they realized they were tracking the same predator across multiple victims. "We need to go to the police," Jennifer said. "With both of our cases, the pattern is too clear to ignore." But Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. We need one more thing. We need her to make a mistake in the present tense, not just have evidence of past crimes. We need to catch her doing something actively illegal, something that forces an immediate investigation." Eleanor explained her plan. She would continue to appear weak, defeated, not a threat. She would let Vanessa think she had one. And she would watch carefully for the next move. Because Vanessa would make another move. She was too greedy, too confident, too successful at her crimes to stop now. She would target someone else, or she would do something with Michael's assets, or she would make some financial play that they could document and report. "How long are you willing to wait?" Jennifer asked. Eleanor's expression was cold and determined. "As long as it takes. I have one job now, and that's making sure Vanessa pays for what she did. I'll wait years if I have to." But as it turned out, Eleanor didn't have to wait nearly that long. Because Vanessa, confident in her victory and convinced that Eleanor was no longer a threat, was about to get very sloppy indeed. The break that Eleanor had been waiting for came from the most unlikely source: Vanessa's own ambition. About 6 months after Richard's death, Vanessa took a position on the board of a local charity organization. It was a prestigious volunteer role, the kind of position that successful people cultivated for networking and social status. The organization managed scholarship funds for underprivileged children, and Vanessa threw herself into the work with apparent passion and dedication. Eleanor learned about Vanessa's new role through Michael, who mentioned it during one of their increasingly rare phone conversations. He was proud of his wife's civic involvement, proud of how she was using her financial expertise to help others. Eleanor listened and said all the right things, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. Charity, financial management, access to other people's money. It was exactly the kind of setup Vanessa had exploited before in Denver. Eleanor began watching the charity's public records. As a non-profit organization, they were required to file regular financial reports that were available to the public. Eleanor requested copies going back 5 years, studying them carefully, looking for anything unusual. At first, everything appeared normal. Then, about 3 months after Vanessa joined the board, Eleanor noticed something odd. Small discrepancies in the numbers. Donations that seemed slightly inflated. Expenses that didn't quite match up to documented activities. It was subtle. Without knowing what to look for, most people would never notice. But Eleanor had become an expert in Vanessa's methods, and she recognized the pattern. Vanessa was doing it again. She was embezzling from the charity, siphoning off money in small amounts that wouldn't trigger immediate alarm but would add up to substantial theft over time. Eleanor documented everything. She compared the public financial reports against the charity's published activities. She checked donation records against thank you letters published in their newsletter. She found discrepancies everywhere. Donations that were acknowledged publicly but didn't appear in the financial reports. Vendor payments for services that were never actually rendered. It was a careful, systematic theft, and Vanessa had probably been planning it from the moment she joined the board. But Eleanor needed more than just her own analysis. She needed official confirmation. So she did something risky. She filed an anonymous complaint with the state's Charity Oversight Board. She included copies of the financial documents with the discrepancies highlighted, along with a detailed analysis of where the money appeared to be going. She didn't mention Vanessa by name in her initial complaint. She simply pointed out that the organization's finances didn't add up and suggested they might want to investigate. The state took anonymous complaints about charity fraud seriously. Within 2 weeks, auditors were examining the organization's books. Within a month, they had identified the same discrepancies Eleanor had found, plus several more. The embezzlement totaled nearly $75,000, funneled through fake vendor accounts and inflated expense reports. And all of it traced back to one person, board member Vanessa Grant, who had signing authority over many of the accounts in question. The scandal broke in the local news on a Thursday morning. Eleanor sat in her apartment reading the article online, feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time: satisfaction. The article didn't mention arrests yet, but it detailed the embezzlement, named Vanessa as being under investigation, and noted that authorities were examining whether this was connected to similar incidents in other states. Eleanor's phone rang less than an hour later. It was Michael, and he sounded devastated. "Mom, did you see the news? About Vanessa? It's not true. It can't be true. Someone must have made a mistake." "What did Vanessa say?" Eleanor asked carefully. "She says she's being framed. That someone on the board had access to the same accounts and is trying to pin their theft on her." She's hiring a lawyer. Mom, you believe her, don't you? You don't think she would actually do something like this? Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. This was when she had to decide whether to plant the seeds of doubt or to wait longer. She chose to wait. I don't know what to believe, Michael, she said honestly. But I hope the investigation gets to the truth, whatever that is. The investigation moved quickly. Once authorities started digging into Vanessa's background, they found the pattern Eleanor had already discovered. The embezzlement in Denver. The suspicious deaths of James Morrison and Richard Grant. The name changes. The bankruptcy. Everything Eleanor had carefully documented was now being examined by professional investigators with actual legal authority. But the case that really caught the prosecutor's attention was the insurance fraud. Once they started looking at Richard's death with suspicious eyes, they noticed what Eleanor had noticed months earlier. The timing of the beneficiary change, the irregularities with his medication, the sudden death of an otherwise healthy man. They obtained warrants to examine medical records, pharmacy records, insurance documents. And then they found something Eleanor hadn't known about. In going through Vanessa's computer files, seized as part of the embezzlement investigation, they discovered searches she had conducted. Searches for undetectable poisons. How to cause a heart attack. Changing medication dosages. Life insurance beneficiary rules. The searches had been conducted in the weeks before Richard's death, and Vanessa hadn't been careful about deleting her browser history. It was sloppy. It was arrogant. It was exactly the kind of mistake Eleanor had been waiting for Vanessa to make. And it was damning. Eleanor learned about this evidence from Patricia Rodriguez, who had been quietly monitoring the investigation. Patricia called her on a Friday evening. Her voice excited in a way Eleanor had never heard before. They're going to arrest her, Patricia said. Probably next week. The DA thinks they have enough for charges. Embezzlement definitely, insurance fraud likely. And they're considering pursuing charges related to Richard's death. Eleanor, you did it. Everything you documented, everything you found. It gave them the foundation they needed to build a case. Eleanor sat down slowly, her hands trembling. What about Michael? He's not implicated in anything, Patricia assured her. All the evidence points to Vanessa acting alone. Michael is a victim in this too, in his own way. He's going to need you, Eleanor. When this all comes out, when he realizes what she really is, he's going to need his mother. But Eleanor wasn't sure about that. Michael had chosen Vanessa over her so many times, had believed Vanessa's lies and rejected Eleanor's truth. The damage that had been done to their relationship might be too severe to repair. Still, he was her son. And despite everything, she loved him. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Vanessa was taken into custody at the family home, Eleanor's former home, in full view of the neighbors. The charges were read. Embezzlement, insurance fraud, suspicion of homicide. Bail was set high. Vanessa's perfect facade finally, definitively cracked. The media coverage was extensive. Small-town scandal involving a prominent family, a beautiful villain, possible murder. It had all the elements of a compelling story. Eleanor avoided the reporters who tried to contact her, referred them all to Patricia, and waited to see how Michael would react. He didn't call her. Not immediately. For 3 days, Eleanor heard nothing from her son. She imagined him in that house, surrounded by everything Vanessa had created, trying to process the fact that his wife was a criminal and possibly a murderer. She wanted to reach out, but something held her back. Michael needed to come to this realization on his own. He needed to be the one to take the first step toward rebuilding their relationship. On the 4th day after Vanessa's arrest, Eleanor received an email. Not a call, but an email. It was from Michael and it was brief. Mom, I need to know something. Did you do this? Did you report her to the authorities? Please be honest with me. Eleanor stared at the email for a long time before responding. She could lie, could claim she had nothing to do with the investigation. But she was tired of lies, tired of pretending, tired of the careful games that had defined the last year of her life. She wrote back, I filed an anonymous complaint about the charity fraud after I noticed discrepancies in their public financial reports. I had no direct involvement in the other investigations, but I had documented concerns about your father's death, and I made those concerns available to my lawyer in case anything happened to me. The authorities found their own evidence. I didn't plant anything or lie about anything. I simply made sure the truth had a chance to be discovered. I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry for what you're going through. But I'm not sorry for seeking justice for your father. She sent the email and waited. An hour passed. And two. Then, just as Eleanor was preparing for bed, her phone rang. It was Michael. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice broken. Why didn't you make me see what she was? I tried, Eleanor said gently. You weren't ready to hear it. She killed Dad. The evidence they have. Mom, she killed Dad and I defended her. I chose her over you. I let her push you out of your own home. I believed her when she said you were losing your mind. How can you even talk to me right now? Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. The first real tears she had cried since the night of Richard's death. Because you're my son and I love you. That never changed, Michael. Not once. The conversation lasted over an hour. Michael told her everything. How isolated he had felt, how Vanessa had controlled every aspect of their life together, how he had noticed things that seemed wrong but had explained them away because he loved her and wanted to believe in her. Eleanor listened without judgment, without saying, I told you so, without any of the recriminations she had every right to express. They were both victims of Vanessa, just in different ways. Can I come see you? Michael asked finally. Tomorrow. Yes, Eleanor said. Please. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed in her small apartment and felt something shift inside her chest. The revenge was complete. Vanessa had been exposed, arrested, would face justice for her crimes. But the victory tasted nothing like Eleanor had imagined. It wasn't triumphant or satisfying or sweet. It was simply exhausting. She had won. But the cost had been everything. Her husband was still dead. A year of her life had been consumed by investigation and documentation. Her relationship with her son was damaged, perhaps irreparably. The house she had loved was tainted by memories of Vanessa's occupation. Everything had changed, and none of it could ever be changed back. Eleanor closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness. Richard, I hope you know the truth now. I hope wherever you are, you understand that I fought for you. I'm sorry it took so long. The exposure was complete. The trap had worked. Justice was being served. But Eleanor Grant lay alone in her small apartment, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal documents, and wondered if any of it had been worth the price she'd paid. The trial took place 8 months after Vanessa's arrest, in the county courthouse that had stood in the center of town for over 100 years. Eleanor attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the back row of the gallery, watching as the case she had spent a year building was presented to a jury of 12 strangers. The prosecution had built a compelling narrative. They presented evidence of the embezzlement from the charity, showing exactly how Vanessa had created fake vendors and inflated expense reports to steal $75,000. They demonstrated her pattern of behavior across multiple states, introducing evidence from Denver and San Francisco that showed this wasn't an isolated incident but a career of fraud and manipulation. Then they turned to the deaths. James Morrison's death in San Francisco 5 years earlier. The insurance payout that Vanessa had collected before disappearing and changing her name. And finally, Richard Grant's death. The changed beneficiary designation 2 weeks before his death. The irregularities with his medication. The searches on Vanessa's computer about causing heart attacks and undetectable poisons. Vanessa's defense attorney tried to create reasonable doubt. The computer searches could have been for research purposes. Vanessa worked in finance, she might have been concerned about insurance fraud in general. The medication irregularities could have been pharmacy errors. The timing of the beneficiary change could have been coincidence. James Morrison's death had been investigated and ruled natural causes. But the pattern was too clear, too consistent. When you looked at Vanessa's entire history, when you saw the repetition of behavior, The coincidences piled up until they stopped being coincidences and became evidence of intent. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. This defendant has a method. She identifies wealthy targets, gains their trust, isolates them from their families, takes control of their finances, and then eliminates them when convenient. She's done it at least twice that we can prove, and possibly more times that we haven't discovered yet. She is a predator, and she must be stopped. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned with a verdict, the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and people who had followed the case from the beginning. Eleanor sat in her usual spot, her hands folded in her lap, barely breathing as the foreman stood to read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: embezzlement, insurance fraud, first-degree murder in the death of Richard Grant. The courtroom erupted in noise. Gasps, murmurs, the scratch of reporters' pens on paper. Vanessa sat frozen at the defense table, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Then, as the officers moved forward to take her into custody, Vanessa did something Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. She turned around, scanning the courtroom until her eyes found Eleanor, and she screamed, "You think you won, Eleanor?" Vanessa's voice was raw, desperate, stripped of all the polish and control that had defined her for so long. "You destroyed your own family. You destroyed your son. Everything you did to me, you did to him too." The officers were trying to restrain her, to lead her out of the courtroom, but Vanessa kept screaming, kept staring at Eleanor with eyes full of rage and something else. Was it fear? Was it recognition that she had finally met someone who was just as relentless as she was? "You're just like me," Vanessa shrieked as they pulled her toward the door. "You're just as cold, just as calculating. You destroyed me the same way I destroyed you. You're no better." Then Michael appeared in the courtroom doorway, having been testifying for the prosecution earlier and waiting in a separate room. He had heard everything: the verdict, Vanessa's screaming, her accusations. His face was pale, his eyes red from crying, but his expression was resolute. "Vanessa," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. She stopped struggling, turned to face him. "You want to compare my mother to yourself? Fine. Let's compare. My mother spent a year collecting evidence and working with lawyers to expose your crimes through the legal system. She didn't poison anyone. She didn't forge documents. She didn't kill anyone. She just made sure the truth came out." "Michael," Vanessa's voice changed, became pleading. "I did it for us. Everything I did it so we could have a life together, so we could be secure. For us." Michael's voice rose, trembling with emotion. "You killed my father. You changed his medication. You made him think my mother was the problem while you were slowly murdering him. Don't you dare tell me you did that for us." Vanessa fell to her knees, sobbing now, her perfect facade completely shattered. "I loved you. I still love you. Please, Michael, please." "You don't know what love is," Michael said quietly. "Love doesn't destroy people. Love doesn't kill. Love doesn't manipulate and lie and steal. Whatever you felt for me, that wasn't love. That was ownership. That was control." He turned to face Eleanor, walking past Vanessa without another glance. When he reached his mother, he wrapped his arms around her, and they held each other while Vanessa was dragged from the courtroom, still crying, still screaming, still trying to justify everything she had done. The hallway outside the courthouse was chaos. Camera flashes filled the space, reporters shouting questions, trying to get statements from anyone involved in the trial. Eleanor and Michael stood together, Patricia Rodriguez creating a protective barrier between them and the press. "Mrs. Grant, how do you feel about the verdict? Michael, will you reconcile with your mother? Was Richard Grant murdered? How did you discover the truth?" The questions came from all sides, overlapping, demanding. But Eleanor had prepared for this moment. She had thought carefully about what she wanted to say, about how she wanted this chapter of her life to be remembered. She stepped forward, Patricia beside her, and faced the cameras. I'm grateful that the jury saw through Vanessa's deceptions and that justice is being served, Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. My husband Richard was a good man who deserved better than the death he received. I'm glad that the truth is finally known. As for my family, we have a lot of healing to do and we need privacy to do that. Thank you. She turned away from the cameras, took Michael's hand, and walked toward Patricia's car. They didn't answer any more questions. They didn't provide the dramatic sound bites the media wanted. They simply left, 3 people who had survived Vanessa's schemes and were now faced with the task of rebuilding lives that had been shattered. That evening, in Eleanor's small apartment, Michael and Eleanor sat together over tea, the first quiet moment they'd had since the verdict. The weight of everything that had happened hung between them. Richard's death, the year of separation, the trial, the exposure of Vanessa's true nature. I keep thinking about what she said in the courtroom, Michael said quietly. About you being just like her. Is there any truth to that, Mom? Eleanor considered the question carefully. It was something she had asked herself many times over the past year, during the long nights of investigation and planning. I pursued justice, Michael. I didn't pursue murder. I didn't steal or manipulate or destroy innocent lives. But did I become colder in the process? Did I lose some part of myself in the pursuit of revenge? I think I did. Do you regret it? Michael asked. The investigation, the evidence gathering, all of it. Eleanor looked at her son, really looked at him. He was thinner than he'd been a year ago, older somehow, marked by the trauma of discovering that the person he loved was a monster. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. I regret that your father died and that I couldn't save him. I regret the year we lost, the time we can never get back. But do I regret fighting for the truth? Well, never. Michael nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. For not listening to you, for choosing Vanessa, for letting her push you out of your own home. I'm sorry for not seeing what she was. You loved her, Eleanor said gently. Love makes us blind sometimes. It's not your fault. Dad died because I was blind, Michael said, his voice breaking. If I had listened to you, if I had questioned things, maybe he'd still be alive. Eleanor reached across the table and took her son's hand. Your father's death is Vanessa's fault. Only hers. You were a victim too, Michael. She manipulated you, lied to you, used your love as a weapon. You're not responsible for her crimes. They sat together in the quiet apartment as evening turned to night, 2 survivors of the same storm trying to find solid ground again. Outside, the town that had once been Eleanor's home went about its business, largely unaware of the profound changes that had occurred in the Grant family. The house that Eleanor had lost still stood, but it was tainted now, filled with memories of Vanessa's occupation. What happens now? Michael asked. Now we heal, Eleanor said. However long it takes, we heal. The day of truth had come and gone. Justice had been served. Vanessa would spend the next several decades in prison. Her perfect facade destroyed, her crimes exposed. But as Eleanor sat with her son in the small apartment that had become her refuge in her prison, she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Victory in a battle like this doesn't mean restoration. It means survival. And survival, while precious, comes at a cost that can never quite be calculated until the fighting is over and you're left to count what remains. Eleanor had won her war against Vanessa. But looking at her son's haunted eyes, at the empty chair where Richard should have been sitting, at the small space that had replaced the home she'd loved, Eleanor wondered if winning and losing were really so different after all. The courtroom had declared justice. But the silence that followed the verdict was heavier than any triumph could ever be. I thought revenge would taste like victory. That's what everyone tells you, isn't it? That justice served brings closure, that exposing evil brings peace, that winning the battle heals the wounds inflicted by the war. I spent a year believing that. A year carefully constructing the trap that would finally bring Vanessa down, believing that when it closed around her, I would feel whole again. But it tasted like ashes instead. The verdict came down on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, the news cycle had moved on to other scandals, other tragedies, other stories that would briefly capture public attention before fading away. Within a week, the reporters stopped calling. Within a month, people stopped asking me about it. Life, as it always does, moved forward. But I remained frozen in that moment, in that courtroom, watching Vanessa being dragged away while she screamed that I had destroyed my own family. The worst part was that she wasn't entirely wrong. Got my life back, yes. That's what everyone tells me when they see me now. They smile and say how brave I was, how strong, how remarkable that I fought for justice. They tell me I did the right thing, that Richard would be proud, that I should hold my head high. And I smile back and thank them because that's what you do. You accept the narrative that makes everyone comfortable. But the truth is more complicated than the story people want to hear. I got my life back, but it's not the life I had before. That life is gone forever, buried alongside Richard in the cemetery at the edge of town. I visit his grave every Sunday now, standing beside the headstone that bears his name and the dates that bookend his existence. I tell him about the trial, about the verdict, about how Vanessa will spend the rest of her life in prison. I tell him that justice was served, that the truth came out, that his death wasn't in vain. But I don't tell him what it cost. I don't tell him about the nights I lie awake wondering if there was another way, a path I didn't see because I was too focused on revenge to look for it. I don't tell him about the look in Michael's eyes, the way he flinches sometimes when he looks at me, as if seeing something in me that he never saw before and wishes he could unsee. I lost my son in the fire I set. Not literally. Michael still calls me, still visits, still says he loves me. But the relationship we had before, the easy warmth and trust and connection, that's gone. It burned away in the heat of my pursuit of justice. Michael sees me now as someone capable of cold, calculated action. Someone who spent a year patiently gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Someone who, in his words during one particularly difficult conversation, became a hunter. He's not wrong. That's what I became. What I had to become to survive, to fight back, to make sure Vanessa didn't destroy anyone else. But in becoming that person, I lost the person I was before. The mother who Michael remembered, who he thought he knew. She died in the same fire that consumed Vanessa's freedom. The house is mine again. That's one tangible victory I can point to. After the trial, after Vanessa's assets were frozen and her fraudulent transfers unwound, the family home reverted to me. I could move back in, reclaim my space, restore the life that was taken from me. Everyone expected me to do exactly that. To triumphantly return to my rightful place, to erase the traces of Vanessa's occupation, to rebuild. But I can't. I've tried. I've walked through those rooms, touched the walls, stood in the kitchen where I used to cook Sunday dinners for my family. And all I feel is emptiness. The house is just a building now. Just wood and brick and glass. The home that existed there is gone, and no amount of redecorating or reclaiming can bring it back. Too much happened within those walls. Too much was lost. The ghosts that live there now aren't the warm memories of the life Richard and I built. They're the cold memories of Vanessa's manipulation, of Richard's decline, of the systematic dismantling of everything I loved. So the house sits empty most days. I pay the bills, maintain the property, but I still live in my small apartment across town. The apartment that was supposed to be my exile has become my choice. It's the place where I transformed from victim to hunter. It's where I spent countless nights piecing together evidence and building my case. It holds its own ghosts, but they're ghosts of my own creation, and somehow that makes them easier to live with. Michael tried to talk to me about it last month. He came over for dinner, and after we'd finished eating, after we'd made awkward small talk about his work and the weather and everything except what really mattered, he finally asked the question I knew was coming. "Mom, are you okay?" "Really?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to give him the answer that would make things easier, that would let us both pretend that justice had healed everything and we could simply move forward. But I've done enough pretending. Enough performing for others' comfort. "No," I told him. "I'm not okay. I don't know if I ever will be again." He looked stricken, guilty, as if my pain was his fault. "Is it because of what I said? About you being a hunter?" "Mom, I didn't mean." You meant it, I interrupted gently. And you were right. That's what I became. What I had to become. And I can't regret it, Michael, because it was necessary. But I also can't pretend it didn't change me in ways I'll never be able to undo. We sat in silence for a long time after that. Finally, Michael said, "What Vanessa said in the courtroom about you destroying the family, I don't believe that. She destroyed the family. You just made sure she faced consequences for it." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe we both destroyed it in different ways. Maybe that's the real cost of revenge. Not just what you do to your enemy, but what you do to yourself and everyone around you in the process." That conversation haunts me now, as I sit here in my apartment on a quiet Sunday evening, listening to the world outside continue on without pause. I light a candle by the window, watching the flame dance and flicker in the darkness. It's become a ritual of sorts, this quiet moment of reflection at the end of each week. A time to acknowledge what was lost, what was gained, what remains. The candle's flame reminds me of fire, the metaphorical fire I set to burn away Vanessa's lies and expose her crimes. Fire purifies, they say. It destroys the corrupt and leaves only truth behind. But fire also consumes everything in its path, making no distinction between the guilty and the innocent, between what should be preserved and what should be destroyed. I think about forgiveness sometimes. Not forgiveness of Vanessa. I'll never forgive her for what she did to Richard, for the calculated cruelty of her crimes. But forgiveness of myself for the choices I made, for the person I became, for the relationships I damaged in my pursuit of justice. That's a forgiveness I'm not sure I'm capable of granting. Maybe forgiveness was the revenge I should have chosen. That's what haunts me most in these quiet moments. What if I had walked away? What if I had let Vanessa have her hollow victory? Had accepted my losses and focused on rebuilding what remained instead of destroying what she had built? Would Richard still be gone? Would Vanessa still have gotten away with her crimes? Probably. But would Michael and I have a real relationship instead of this fragile, damaged thing we're both trying so hard to repair? Would I still recognize myself when I look in the mirror? I don't know. That's the terrible truth. I don't know if there was another path, and I'll never know because I didn't take it. I chose revenge, dressed up in the respectable clothing of justice. I chose to hunt instead of heal. And that choice defined everything that came after. But here's what I do know. Vanessa is in prison, and she'll remain there for the rest of her life. She can't hurt anyone else. She can't destroy any more families, can't kill any more trusting men, can't manipulate any more sons into abandoning their mothers. That matters. It has to matter, or else what was it all for? James Morrison's sister Jennifer called me last week. We've become strange friends, bound together by our shared experience of surviving Vanessa's predation. She told me she's been sleeping better lately, knowing that Vanessa has finally faced justice. She told me that our investigation gave her closure, gave her peace. You saved other people, Jennifer said. Other potential victims who will never even know they were in danger because you stopped her. I hold on to that thought on the hard days. When Michael visits and I see the distance in his eyes. When I walk past the empty house that used to be my home. When I lie awake at night wondering if I made the right choices. I think about the people who will never meet Vanessa, who will never have their lives destroyed by her, and I tell myself it was worth it. But I also whisper into the darkness, words that no one else will ever hear. Maybe forgiveness was the revenge I should have chosen. Outside my window, snow has begun to fall. Soft, gentle flakes drifting down from the dark sky, covering the town in a blanket of white. Snow has a way of making everything look peaceful, serene, as if the world itself has paused to rest. I watch it accumulate on the streets below, on the cars and trees and buildings, erasing the edges of things, making everything soft and undefined. The town will wake up tomorrow morning to a transformed landscape. Everything will look different, cleaner, newer. But underneath the snow, everything remains exactly the same. The snow is just a temporary covering, a beautiful illusion that will melt away when the sun rises and reality reasserts itself. That's what revenge is, I think. A beautiful illusion that promises transformation but delivers only temporary satisfaction. Underneath, everything remains broken. The losses remain losses. The dead remain dead. The relationships damaged in the pursuit of justice remain damaged. Revenge doesn't heal. It just covers the wounds in a layer of righteous anger that eventually melts away, leaving you staring at the same pain you started with. I blow out the candle, watching the thin trail of smoke rise and dissipate in the darkness. The flame is gone, but the wax remains, marked by its burning, permanently changed by the fire that consumed it. That's what I am now, permanently changed by the fire of my own making, marked by the choices I made and the person I became. Tomorrow Michael is coming over for brunch. We'll sit together in this small apartment and try to bridge the distance between us. We'll talk about his work, about his plans for the future, about anything except Vanessa and the trial and the year we lost. We'll perform normalcy for each other, hoping that if we pretend long enough, it might become real. And maybe someday it will. Maybe time really does heal, not the betrayal itself, but the wounds inflicted by seeking justice for it. Maybe Michael and I will find our way back to each other. We'll rebuild a relationship that's different from what we had before but still meaningful, still real. Maybe I'll learn to live with the person I became, to accept that transformation as necessary even if it was painful. Or maybe not. Maybe this is simply who I am now, a woman who won everything and lost what mattered most. A woman who sits alone in a small apartment, lighting candles for the dead and watching snow fall on a town that no longer remembers her name. My name is Eleanor Grant, and I destroyed the woman who destroyed me. But in doing so, I discovered the terrible truth that no one tells you about revenge. When you set fire to your enemy's world, you can't control where the flames spread. And sometimes, by the time you realize what you've burned, it's far too late to save anything from the ashes. The snow continues to fall outside my window, silent and relentless, covering everything in white. Inside, I sit in the darkness, a woman who survived, a mother who lost her son while he still lived, a widow who avenged her husband's death but couldn't bring him back. Got my revenge. Got my justice. Got my truth. But I lost myself somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure I'll ever find my way back to who I was before. Maybe that's the final cost of revenge. Not just what you take from your enemy, but what you sacrifice of yourself in the taking. The candle smoke has dissipated now, faded into the darkness like a ghost returning to wherever ghosts go when their haunting is done. And I sit here alive and victorious and utterly alone, wondering if maybe, just maybe, forgiveness would have been the wiser choice after all. But it's too late for that now. The fire has burned. The damage is done. And all that remains is to live with the consequences of the choices I made, day after day after day, until my own story finally ends and someone else has to decide what lessons, if any, can be drawn from the ashes I've left behind.